Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Um, Last time, we finished up with the horror tale, talking about what horror tales are about, what makes a horror tale. That was our second big section. Out of our three big sections, that's number two. That's B. The next big section, and our last of the big sections, is horror's history. To put that a little bit less mouthfulish. History of horror. And that is what I'm hoping to start right now. I have my hot water. Today is going to be a sort of transition day. I had a transition week because I didn't do any new videos last time. I was using this to go back and do the old videos. So the last video you've seen was Ghosts, and that was the first video I did with this thing. And then I did a bunch of other ones previous. I still have more to do in the backtracking back to number one. I think I'm up to Overreacher plot when I'm working backwards. I'm going to try to go forwards now for a bit. Now that I've done my research, I needed to do a couple days of research for History of Horror. So I have research done. History of Horror, text-wise, we're going to be dealing with a lot of Lovecraft, supernatural horror and literature. We're going to get into him deeply. And that's my rent money. Stephen King, dance for 20th century stuff. I think rent money should go here so I don't lose it. It's almost rent pay. And a few other places. Of course, Dance Macabre's second version, the one I'm recommending for you guys, which has What's Scary? What's Scary? Yeah, that's the one. I have it on audiobook, so I don't have the book version of that. It's in my car, and I've been listening to it pretty much that first section on repeat to keep me in the brain, keep it in my brain. Now, that was written in 2010, so it's 2013 now. I still have to get, there's 3 years of horror stuff that aren't included in What is Scary, and he doesn't really talk about a lot of things. He doesn't talk about What is Scary does not include everything from 1981 when he wrote Dance Macabre to 2010. No, that's a huge chunk, in which Stephen King was very pivotal, not to mention, in which he doesn't really discuss a lot except a couple of movies. The zombie types and documentary types specifically. And then the slashery, not slashery necessarily, but malevolent other types. Typified by Last House on Love? Last House on the Left. And the modern movies. He doesn't talk about books much at all. I don't think at all. So I have to get the information for that area, and I have a problem with conventionally teaching history. When you teach history, in general, when you're taught history in school, if you're the student, which I guess you are in this case. It feels weird for me to be the teacher, but that's fine. When you are the student and you're taught history in school, they basically pick an arbitrary point. Not necessarily completely arbitrary, but it's an arbitrary point. 1492 for American history is usually a starting point. It makes sense for it to be a starting point. It's when Columbus discovered the New World. Not to mention it's been discovered by other people before that, and whatnot, etc., etc. But 1492 is as good a place as any. That makes it pretty much arbitrary. You don't have a reference point because you don't know what was going on in 1490, in the early 1490s, the 1480s. What Isabel and Ferdinand's life was like, why they were open to letting Columbus go, sending him off on his journey. Or 1492 is also when Alexander the Sixth becomes Pope. And if you want a really interesting character in history, you look to Alexander the Sixth. Most would just call him a jerk, but jerks are usually interesting characters in history. Not necessarily nice characters, but interesting. And then there's stuff going on between Alexander and Ferdinand and Isabel, makes them the Catholic monarchy, which is pretty big. There's lots going on that isn't really mentioned. So you start at 1492 and you're going forward, you miss all the stuff that's the backstory of what's going on before 1492. So you're unanchored there. It seems reasonable place to start, and it is, but you're sort of unanchored. There's no context for starting at that time. And usually when you're in the classroom situation, when you're a kid, you only get so far. It was always supposed to be whatever time until present, and you never get to the present time. So you felt lost. Like if a class would have said, "Oh, get to present," and they would have gotten to the Vietnam War, I could have sort of figured out in high school, not in middle school or elementary school. I sort of figured out what was going on from Vietnam to present, and how stuff from Vietnam was sort of affecting stuff from present. Sort of. Not 100%, but I could have gotten a rough idea. But we didn't even stop at Vietnam. We stopped in the Gilded Age, or we stopped before World War I, or we stopped during the beginnings of the Depression at the stock market crash, or Prohibition. I didn't have any concept of how Prohibition or Gilded Age or World War I had effects on my today. There was no anchor for me in the present when thinking about World War I. I still don't have one. I think my total history of World War I boils down to 2 sentences. It began with Archduke Ferdinand's assassination, and it ended with the League of Nations, which failed, leading to World War II. That's what I have for World War I. That's my high school education. I guess I know a little bit after that. Not a whole lot has retained. I've not retained a whole lot, though. So, I like teaching history backwards, or I like learning history backwards, or I like talking about history backwards. Starting now, and going back. How did the early 2000s, the 2000s affect our life today? How did the 90s affect that time? The 22Ks, I guess. How did the 80s affect the 90s? How did the 70s affect the 80s? How did the 60s affect the 70s? If you go backwards, you keep our context, which is today. And that's why I'm basically going to start with what is scary and work my way backwards from there. Problem is, What is Scary doesn't focus on a whole lot, so I have to do a lot of legwork on my own, which is why I needed to do a few more videos while I was doing research. Then I had to find some more videos about history of horror. I did find one or two, and I'll definitely point them out to you. Not the best videos, but worth checking out or if you're interested. I'll point out the good parts. I'll point out the good times. And I do a bunch of light work on, well, let's just look at Stephen King for a while. And let's look at Joe Hill. And let's look at S.P. Santel. Check out S.P. Santel. He's awesome. Who else is on the list? From the 80s. And then we go into the 70s, which is the beginning of King, going forward into, before that was like, okay, you have The Exorcist, and you have Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby. You go back a little bit further, and you have, 50s genre, and then we're really hooking into Stephen King's Dance Macabre. We're going to go into the 50s and 60s. And he actually goes over a lot of that, and I'm just going to be diving right into King, so he gets to do some of the legwork for me. And then once we get King started, that will run into the beginning part of the century, and that's where HP leaves off. Now, HP goes back to the beginnings of horror. And of course, he teaches history conventionally. He starts at the first horror books you could possibly consider horror. He mentions the Book of Enoch, Beowulf, the Satyricon, Solomon's Key, maybe a few others. The problem is, with those, is you're still kind of arbitrary. And then he goes into the early Gothics. You're not really sure what even the early Gothics read out of those four. Did they read Solomon's Key? Possibly. Maybe not. Did they read the Book of Enoch? Oh, it's kind of hard to tell because it wasn't really readily available. Did they read Beowulf? Probably. Did they read Satyricon? Possibly. Did they read, Ovid's Metamorphoses? Yes, probably. And Shakespeare's scary stuff. Yeah, they had that in there. Had that available to them. But did that fully form? Was that a direct line into them writing, hey, I like, Shakespeare's scary stuff, and I like Beowulf's scary stuff, and I like Ovid's scary stuff, and I like the Satyricon scary stuff. Let's write scary books? No, not really. Because they didn't write pure scary books. They wrote Gothic romances, which are kind of horrorish, but not what we consider horror. So they most likely read stuff that was from the decades before them, which aren't necessarily horrorish or have supernatural elements at all, or scary elements at all. They just sort of influenced them and tweaked them in a certain way that did it. And do you want to start there in your teaching and then go forward? Because that seems weird, because then you have to go, what those people were influenced by. So teaching backwards certainly has an appeal. You don't, and then of course you don't end up you don't run out of time in the course and end up in a place like Prohibition or the stock market crash in '29 or World War I, where the students aren't taking it in because it's the end of the semester, and they end up not having any knowledge of the subject at all, and they don't have any reference into today, into contemporary times. As a child of the 90s and 80s, when I was learning this in the early 90s or mid 90s, what did I know about how World War I was affecting us? I didn't. I still barely do. I've done some research on it today even, and it's still confusing. Luckily, it's easier for art history to go backwards. Not necessarily history of horror, because I'm going to have to do a lot of legwork on my own. But it's easily explained, and people do talk about influences of artists by previous artists. If you start with an artist of today, it doesn't even have to be an artist of today, just artists that people today are familiar with. I'm not going to go into, painters today. I don't even know. I could probably pull out a few if I did some research for a bit. But I'm just going to go with, one of the ones that people probably know and work my way backwards into an idea. Oh, do I want painting first? I'm going to do the music example first, which is because it's easier. You can take any band from today and say, okay, what bands in the 2010s, how were they influenced from music in the 90s? Any rock band today is probably influenced by the Foo Fighters. Foo Fighters is obviously influenced by Nirvana. Nirvana is obviously influenced by the Pixies. The Pixies is obviously influenced by the punk and Ramones-y stuff that was coming in the 70s. So you're already bound to the 70s. 70s, Ramones, you get their influences back to the Beatles and Stones. Passing through the Stooges and the New York Dolls while you go. And then you still get to the Beatles and the Stones, and then you can go back. But most people know the Beatles and may not know, you here there in the audience land, may not know many contemporary bands today, and I don't listen to a lot of contemporary bands today besides punk music, and they're usually throwbacks right to the Ramones right away, or within one or two steps. Punk, contemporary punk, going back to mid-punk, going back to early punk. It's a straight line. So let's start at the Beatles, because most people know the Beatles, and most people know that most bands were influenced by the Beatles from today, in some way, shape, or form. If they're rock bands, if they're hip-hop or tripping over my wires here. If they're hip-hop or R&B, you have another set of down to soul music. You can go back that way, but Beatles is going to hit the same point as well. There's going to be some convergence in the history. So I have Beatles up here. Beatles influenced a lot by Buddy Holly, Elvis, and Chuck Berry. Buddy Holly and Elvis were also influenced by Chuck Berry, so there's a point of convergence right there. And Chuck Berry's contemporary is not just Chuck Berry, it's just the easiest one for most people to understand. Bo Diddley is another great example. And of course, Elvis and Buddy Holly also had a country influence, probably back through Williams. Come on, Drew. I think I'm not saying the wrong one, because I want to say Andy Williams. I know that's not it. That's not an influence on the Beatles. Okay, so his son and his grandson. For God's sakes, what is it? Oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking on it. I'm gonna have to look this up. Anyway, so we're gonna go back to while I'm cheating. While I'm cheating, let's go through Chuck Berry's influence. Hank Williams. Oh my God, I didn't type it all in. I remembered it before I got it halfway typed to Google. But Hank Williams, of course, would be another huge influence on Buddy Holly and Elvis. And of course on the Beatles themselves. They went far enough back to listen to some Hank. So you go back to Hank Williams and stuff like that. You can go further back into the countryside of that. Let's not go back into that. Let's go through Chuck Berry's side, because the black music of the time was heavily influenced on Buddy Holly and Elvis, who influenced the Beatles, who of course listened to Chuck Berry as well, and Little Richard, etc. So let's go back to Chuck Berry's influences. You can go right to it. Chicago Blues, 10, 15 years earlier than Chuck Berry. When blues guys were first starting to plug in, do electric stuff in Chicago. Go back 20, 30 years before that, you get the Delta blues from Mississippi and the down south. Back to Robert Johnson himself, the king of the Delta blues, the originator of modern American music. I would not be remiss in saying. I think probably if you took Robert Johnson and Hank Williams and you had them side by side, it'd be a coin toss to say who influenced more people. That Delta blues influenced by slave spirituals. When they were slaves, they had their own style of music. Usually spiritual music. What we have left. Of course, very influential on gospel. They're also going back into influential on R&B and rap of today. So that's another point of convergence. And that goes back to traditional African music. I took a history of pop music and I took a history of jazz music in college, courses in college. And taught by the same guy, but he started both courses with, hey, let's listen to some traditional African music. This is the pygmy music. The pygmies were the short ones, so they weren't really taken as slaves all that often, so their culture was sort of not as disturbed as other African peoples. So they were the purest form of African music, traditional African music, is to the pygmies. So let's listen to pygmy music. A lot of call and response, which happens in slave spirituals, happens a bit in Delta blues, happens further on in, it happens nowadays. Ramones, Hey Ho, Let's Go, that's call and response. Different time signatures. This is kind of getting esoteric. I apologize. But that's going to be right into jazz, the jazz line of different time signatures, messing with beats. It's going to go right in through jazz, through bebop, through modern jazz, right back to, and it goes right back to traditional African music. If you listen to a Beatles song, you're not going to, and back to back with a traditional African song, you're not going to hear the similarities. But if you were learning it historically, you could trace it back. Like, oh, let's listen to Chuck Berry for a week. All right, well, let's listen to Delta Blues for a week. And then listen to, Chicago Blues for a week. Then listen to Delta Blues for a week. Then listen to slave spirituals for a week. And then listen to traditional African music for a week. Then you get the idea of how the influence is there. Well, that's the believe it or not, I apologize. This is getting a little bit weird. Believe it or not, that's the easier example. It's easier to do with art than it is to do with those conventional histories, political histories. How did the previous president influence the current president? You could do it that way, and it's going to be weird. It might be interesting. I would certainly love to learn that way. But it's going to be difficult. And it would be a long course. A very long course. But the other example I had was I just took a painter that most people would know. Fairly recent, but not unheard of, like very contemporary people would be. I took Jackson Pollock, who was part of the abstract expressionist school. And then if you look at the abstract expressionist school, you can't really do that without looking at the expressionists. And from the expressionists, you look at the impressionists. They're sort of one influences another, much more, or rebels against each other. Expressionists could be said to rebel against the impressionists, but the influence is certainly there, whether they consider it rebelling or not. From the impressionists, you have Delacroix, And from the Delacroix, you have the Romanticists, and that's sort of where we're going with horror as well. We're going to be going back to the Romanticists, and you can go earlier as well. What did he say? He said, I did look up Delacroix on Wikipedia before I went on. So early Delacroix was influenced by Rubens, I think. And then you can go from Rubens back. Titian, way back into people I don't really know. Not well enough to talk about in any way. That's what I'm going to attempt to do with horror. It's weird because I'm not just talking about one genre of horror or one artist in horror. I could do this for Stephen King. Hey, who influenced Stephen King? Well, Stephen King actually tells me who influenced him. Who was influenced by Stephen King? Well, I can do that too. You know, we have the splatterpunks, which is probably Somtow's subgenre. Steakley is sort of in that genre as well. You can have a few. Most contemporary horror writers are going to be influenced by King. You can't escape it. And of course by Lovecraft. You're not going to escape the influence of either artists in horror movies or horror books. So I'm not going to start with them. I'm going to start now and then see how the influence shows. What's going to happen next, I guess, is probably the best thing to say. Well, I have to figure out contemporary. What am I going to say about from 2010 to now? 2013 to 2010, really, because I'm going backwards. And of course, I will have, the remake of Evil Dead. One of the most influential ones in the last couple of years, the Cabin in the Woods. And we'll have a few others. We're going to go over, of course, what is scary in Stephen King's essay at the beginning of Danse Macabre. And we're going to talk about Stephen King himself, and we're going to talk about what's been going on in general. Because Stephen King may talk about what's been going on in the 90s and late 90s and 2000s in What is Scary, but he doesn't talk about the 80s at all. I did find a video that did talk about, okay, 60s did this in general, 70s did this in general, 80s did this in general, 90s did this in general, 2000s did this in general, and this is where we are. They, of course, did forward in time, and I'm going backward in time. They did chronologically, I'm doing achronologically. Achronological history, I like that. I'm patenting it. I'm sure someone's thought of it too, with their genius. Because I'm a genius too. No, I'm not. Anyway. Achronological history. I love it. Great. So I'm going to talk about, I'm going to point out what that video points out and go backwards from there. They talked about mostly movies too, unfortunately. So I have to basically handle novels on my own, which is difficult. I'm having to do a lot of web searches because I haven't read the great horror novels of, what are the great horror novels of 2010s, the last 3 years? What are the great novels of the 20Ks, 2Ks? Don't know. I'd have to do a web search and find out. 90s you might have a bit of better luck on. If you go onto IMDb, the Internet Movie Database, you can find lists, user-generated lists, but lists nonetheless, of 10 best horror movies of 2000 to 2010, and then 10 best horror movies of the 90s, 50 best horror movies of the 80s, 20 best horror movies of the 70s, or whatever. You'll find them, 50 best foreign horror movies, which are usually a good one, which I'm going to be referencing a bit when I get to horror anthropology, because I have to do, of course, legwork on that one as well. So yes. So I'm trying to figure out what the best, how to talk about the novels, how to talk about movies that King doesn't really go over. He doesn't talk about ginger snaps, and I love ginger snaps. So I'm going to go over horror movies, and what influenced what, and what influenced what, and what influenced what, and going back and back and back. King talks a little bit about that in horror, and is talking about zombies. He talks about the earlier zombie movies, leading up to Night of the Living Dead, leading up to Dawn of the Dead, leading up to Dawn of the Dead remake, with the fast zombies, and then Diary of the Dead, etc., etc. Going into it. So, you could do a zombie backwards, which would be a pretty straight shot, like this, or this. But, back to the earliest zombie movies, or zombie stories, it's much harder to do that with, oh goodness, facts about the pop. Pardon me, horror in general. Horror is a huge genre. You don't think it, oh, it's scary stuff. No. You have splatter punks, you have torture films, you have conventional monsters, ghosts. Ghosts you might even have. It would even be more convoluted than this. It's just, Ghosts is way too big. Ghost, as King says, is the Mississippi of horror fiction. It's just, one straight line can encompass it. It's just too broad. Vampires. You can do vampires backwards. I could probably do. I'm going to, because I'm trying to find, some sort of link between La Fanu and Polidori, and then backwards from there, which is stuff that I just heard about in Lovecraft book, and I'm like, oh, I've never heard of this. Let's check this out. It's great. Hey. And then going through Lovecraft stuff, trying to find out about his, artists writers that I've never heard of. I couldn't even give you them. But Sax Rohmer, Gerald Fiss, Mary Wilkins, Leonard Klein. I don't know. I'm not familiar with these people. Well, I got to be. Well, all right. Let's see what I can find on these guys. LibriVox.org actually has some great references for that. And Lovecraft does go laundry list on occasion. As it tells you he'll go talk about one guy for 5-6 paragraphs, and then go one paragraph where he mentions 12 authors, thinking that you're in 1930 when he wrote this, or 1920 when he wrote this, and you're familiar with these authors and they're accessible to you. These authors are no longer accessible to me. I'm having a hard time finding them. Project Gutenberg, I can find them sometimes. Sometimes I can't. LibriVox, I can find audiobooks, which is helpful because I can put them on my phone and listen to them on my phone when I'm going for a walk or something. But it's kind of difficult to find some of these things. So, I'm sort of slogging through history of horror. That's probably why it took so long getting back to it. But I'm going to be trying to go backwards. Tomorrow, I'm going to go over what is scary and the video that I found that that had some interesting information. I'm not sure how much of a recommendation I can give to it. When I said the stuff I wasn't going to talk about, like why horror, he talks a lot about why horror. So if you're interested in that, you're welcome to watch that video. I don't think it's a very good video. It was actually taping of a lecture, and he was interrupted nearly constantly, and it was very distracting because the interrupters weren't very well mic'd, so you can only barely hear what they said, and there's banter back and forth, but if you're only hearing one side of the banter, you're not really getting it. And he was led astray by his audience. I'm led astray by my own mind, but he's led astray by other people. So he gets off topic and talking about other things that is just confusing. Yeah. So I will point out the video. I'll of course give links to the video because I'm using it as a reference, so I'm going to give links to it. I'm just not sure how much I can recommend it. It's worth a watch if you have an hour. I'm thinking an hour 20 minutes, and you don't mind being bogged down in the psychology of horror. He's a little highbrow. It's definitely a guy giving a lecture to college students, and he expects you to know certain things. Did have some neat videos in it. Had the first horror video, first horror movie, which is quote. It seems interesting. It was worth it. So I'm going to go over that a bit, and I'll of course be referencing back to that when we talk about the early horror movies when we get to that point. It was like 1890s. That's what we're talking about here. Yeah. So next time I'm going over The King, and I'm going over that video, trying to say, okay, this is basically what you can look for when you're looking at the 2000s. This is basically what you're going to look for when you're looking at the 90s. This is basically what you look for when you're looking at the 80s. I'm not going to go into the 80s. I'm going to say that probably for that video after. And then I can go into Stephen King and talking about King's influence on all these other people, etc. That's your framework. This is sort of a transition video. This is getting into history of horror. I'm teaching it chronologically, going backwards from the present, so you guys have a reference. Hey, I've seen horror movies around today. What movies or what books influenced these movies that I'm familiar with? And then we go back. And like, hey, check out this movie and this movie and this book and this movie. Like, these movies influenced your movies of today. And then you watch these movies and read that book. And you say, oh, I can see the influence on today's movies from these movies and book. And then we go back, okay, let's go back another generation to the 70s. These are the 70s movies and books you should be looking at. Okay, well, that's cool, alright. I can see how that influenced the books on the 80s, and how the 80s influenced the book on the 90s, and movies on the 90s, and how they influenced some movies to today. That's what I'm going to try to shoot for. It's ambitious, and I'm scared, but that's fine. So, I'm going to continue with History of Horror. Tune in next time with me, Drew, on Horror Analysis. Have a good night. And the modern movies. He doesn't talk about books much at all. I don't think at all. So, I have to get the information for that area. And I have a problem with conventionally teaching history. When you teach history, in general, when you're taught history in school, if you're the student, which I guess you are in this case, feels weird for me to be the teacher, but that's fine. When you are the student and you're taught history in school, they basically pick an arbitrary point. Not necessarily completely arbitrary, but it's an arbitrary point. 1492 for American history is usually a starting point. It makes sense for it to be a starting point. It's when Columbus discovered the New World. Not to mention it's been discovered by other people before that, and whatnot, etc., etc. But 1492 is as good a place as any. That makes it pretty much arbitrary. You don't have a reference point because you don't know what was going on in 1490, in the early 1490s, the 1480s. What Isabel and Ferdinand's life was like, what they why they were open to letting Columbus go once previous. I still have more to do in the backtracking back to number 1. I think I'm up to Overreacher plot, but I'm working backwards. I'm going to try to go forwards now for a bit. Now that I've done my research, I needed to do a couple days of research for History of Horror. So I have research done. History of Horror, text-wise, we're going to be dealing with a lot of Lovecraft, supernatural horror and literature. We're going to get into him deeply. And that's my rent money. Stephen King, Dance for 20th century stuff. I think rent money should go here so I don't lose it. It's almost rent pay. And a few other places. Of course, Dance Macabre's second version, the one I'm recommending for you guys, which has What's Scary? What's Scary? Yeah, that's the one. I have it on audiobook, so I don't have them. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Horror Analysis with me, Drew. Last time, we finished up with the horror tale, talking about what horror tales are about, what makes a horror tale. That was our second big section. Out of our 3 big sections, that's number 2, that's B. The next big section, and our last of the big sections, is horror's history. Put that a little bit less mouthfulish. History of horror. And that is what I'm hoping to start right now. I have my hot water. Today is going to be a sort of transition day. I had a transition week because I didn't do any new videos last time. I was using this to go back and do the old videos. So the last video you've seen was Ghosts, and that was the first video I did with this thing. And then I did a bunch of other ones, sending him off on his journey. For 1492 is also when Alexander VI becomes Pope. And if you want a really interesting character in history, you look to Alexander VI. Most would just call him a jerk, but jerks are usually interesting characters in history. Not necessarily nice characters, but interesting. And then there's stuff going on between Alexander and Ferdinand and Isabel, makes them the Catholic monarchy, which is pretty big. There's lots going on that isn't really mentioned. So you start at 1492 and you're going forward, you miss all the stuff that's the backstory of what's going on before 1492. So you're unanchored there. It seems reasonable place to start, and it is, but you're sort of unanchored. There's no context for starting at that time. And usually when you're in the classroom situation, when you're a kid, you only get so far. It was always supposed to be whatever time until present, and you never get to the present time. So you felt lost. Book version of that. It's in my car, and I've been listening to it pretty much that first section on repeat to keep me in the brain, keep it in my brain. Now, that was written in 2010, so it's 2013 now. I still have to get, there's 3 years of horror stuff that aren't included in What is Scary, and he doesn't really talk about a lot of things. He doesn't talk about What is Scary does not include everything from 1981 when he wrote Dance Macabre to 2010. No, that's a huge chunk, um, in which Stephen King was very pivotal, not to mention, in which he doesn't really discuss a lot except a couple of movies. Um, the zombie types and uh, documentary types specifically. Um, and and then the slashery, not slashery necessarily, but malevolent other types, typified by Last House on Left, Last House on the Left.